writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Joni, author engagement specialist at Kobo Writing Life.
And I am Rachel, author engagement coordinator at Kobo Writing Life. Today on the podcast, we are speaking to Bruce McCandless III, who is the author of the biography, Wonders All Around, the incredible true story of astronaut Bruce McCandless II. Now, if you're not familiar with the name Bruce McCandless, you have definitely seen the image. It is a super famous picture of an astronaut sitting in what looks like a chair, floating, tethered to nothing above planet Earth.
This was such a great interview. It was a little bit different, I think, to anything that we've done before, because we've never talked to somebody whose dad was an astronaut. But yeah, it was really great. Bruce spoke to us about the process of writing this, because it's part his own memories of his family and what it was like growing up, but also the story of his dad. So we talked about the process of writing, of researching, of weaving his own memories in with these stories about his father. And he also writes fiction. So we spoke to him a little bit about his general publishing journey, what he's got coming down the pipeline. And we talked a lot about space, which was very cool. We are here today with Bruce McCandless III, author of his latest book, Wonders All Around. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Can you start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and about Wonders All Around?
I sure can. My name is Bruce McCandless III, as you mentioned. I grew up near Johnson Space Center down in Houston. My dad was an astronaut with the program, and so I grew up in Clear Lake and went to high school there, went off to university at the University of Texas, studied abroad for a year and a half, came back and went to law school. Practiced law for 25 years or so, and then I'm retired. I guess I'd say I'm semi-retired. I still have my law license and still consult on some things, but primarily I'm writing these days, and I've written mostly fiction and a fair number of poems and features over the years. But my first big sort of nonfiction project was Wonders All Around, or is Wonders All Around, which was published back in July. It's a story of my dad's career and in particular, and about our family and a little bit about the space program and its evolution during the 60s and 70s, and a little bit into the 80s as well, as sort of the backdrop for that. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but it's a little bit different from most astronaut biographies. There are lots of astronaut biographies. This one's a little bit more person-centered, a little bit more focused on family and relationships and that sort of thing, and maybe a little less technical than some of the other ones.
For those listeners who are unfamiliar, could you kind of tell us who your father is and a little bit about him and his career?
I sure can. So the book is titled Wonders All Around, the incredible true story of astronaut Bruce McCandless II and the first untethered flight in space. And one of the taglines is "Meet the man you never knew you knew." And the reason we came up with that is because a lot of people have seen the photograph of Bruce McCandless II operating what's called the Manned Maneuvering Unit, which is a gas-powered jetpack. And you may have seen a photo that was taken back in 1984 by astronaut Hoot Gibson of Bruce McCandless II floating free in space. But he's not really floating. He's actually using compressed gas to propel himself. But he's out there by himself in space, and the photograph is pretty compelling. And it's sort of become an iconic photograph of the space program and one of NASA's most requested images. That's Bruce McCandless II. He also worked on the Hubble Space Telescope, as we can get into a little bit more as we go along.
It's an amazing photo. We'll include it in the notes so that everyone can see. You mentioned the book, the memoir, is quite a personal story. And I really enjoyed the kid POV and I find that you captured a moment in American history, but also a very specific place that you were in as a child. What was it like growing up in Houston with a dad in the space program? What was that like for your family?
It differed over time. When my dad was selected for the program, astronauts were still these golden boys in the American media, and were getting lots of attention and were seen as heroes by a lot of folks. And so there was a lot of fanfare attendant upon my dad's selection to be in the Group 5 astronaut class. He was, these were the guys who were going to go to the moon. These were the Apollo astronauts who had been chosen, and it was exciting. But after the success of the Apollo program, and in particular Apollo 11, a lot of the enthusiasm sort of dwindled in the American public, and certainly in the American Congress. Funding was cut, and the space program's ambitions sort of became less exciting. And so for me growing up, my dad had never went up on an Apollo flight. As it turned out, he didn't get the sort of attention that, guys like Fred Hayes and Pete Conrad and Neil Armstrong and those guys got. So my childhood was pretty ordinary, really. I mean, the whole community where I lived was full of engineers and astronauts and NASA technicians, and everyone was sort of, not everyone, but the majority of folks were involved with the space program in one way or another. So there was nothing really special about that connection. So I'd say it was pretty much a normal American childhood. We did, as you'll see in the book, we did, road trips with various degrees of family disharmony. And we were, dysfunctional in all the ways that American families are. And, I had long hair as a kid. My dad was a Navy fighter pilot who thought that was ridiculous. I wore jeans with holes in them and didn't want to mow the lawn. And so some of this stuff is, I think, some of the story is relatable, I hope, to folks out there. And then when I get into the space flights, I have to be a little bit more technical, and that may not be quite as, maybe not quite as relatable, but I hope by then you've got some momentum going into the story that you carried along. So I hope that's an answer.
Yeah. For me, like as a non-technical person, I liked that it was more of a personal story. I found that a lot easier to read. I don't know if I would have had the patience to continue if it had been very, very technical. So I liked that a lot. I liked the personal part. Something I thought was interesting was you were talking about what it was like for the wives of astronauts and how challenging, like how they would sort of live afraid that their husbands would come back from space and that would change the dynamic.
Yeah, right. So they were scared when their husbands, when they went up, and there was some tension involved even when they came back down safely, because, space flight is a huge high and for a lot of people. And if you've been working toward it for years and you become suddenly the center of national attention, and you come back down and you realize, hey, I might not get another flight for years, or I may not get another flight at all. There's a pretty well documented sort of depression that sets in, or a deflation. And that was the cause of problems for a lot of married couples at NASA, astronaut couples. And generally speaking, the astronaut wives were sort of a heroic bunch, mostly unheralded. All the astronauts have memorial trees at the Johnson Space Center, but really there should be a special grove for the wives as well, because they put up with a lot and suffered a lot and worked really hard to raise the families. And, while their famous husbands were away back in the 60s and 70s, it's all a lot different now because men and women both are going up, and, there's equality, which is great. But back then, women were expected to do the work and smile, and it was pretty unfair. And my mom was one of those women. I think she deserves a lot of credit, frankly.
Did you feel any pressure to go into the space program yourself, or to do anything like that?
I really didn't. And in fact, I don't know of any of the offspring of astronauts who have become astronauts themselves. I mean, it's not easy to become an astronaut, for one thing, but there are a few who've sort of gone into the space industry generally. But I didn't feel that way. I just wasn't interested in the same things that my dad was when he was a kid. I mean, he grew up from the age of around 10, wanting to go into space and being fascinated by science fiction and rocket propulsion and that sort of thing. And I was fascinated by the Rolling Stones, and so we just I never had the same ambition that he did. So I went to the University of Texas and studied English and history, and he went. He was a kid at the Naval Academy and was much more focused than I ever was. So and to his credit, I mean, his feeling was, if you're not interested in it and motivated, you're not going to be good at it. So don't feel like you have to go to the Naval Academy or try to go into the military just to please me, because no one's going to be happy if you go and you don't like it and you're not able to make a career out of it. So he was pretty sensible about it. I mean, I think there was a brief period when I was a sophomore in college when I was interested, and he was pretty excited and wrote to Senator Phil Gramm in those days and was starting to do some lobbying for me. So I appreciated that. But in the end, I think it was the right decision. I don't think I would have been good in the military or good in the astronaut program. So I think the federal government dodged a bullet when I decided not to do it.
I'm kind of curious about your journey from lawyer to writer, because we've had a lot of authors on this podcast who started their careers in law and then eventually made their way into writing. And I'm just kind of curious what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Being a lawyer is necessarily involves writing and speaking and listening. And I did a fair amount of litigation in my legal career, and that's tremendously writing intensive. And so you sort of feel at times, depending on what kind of law you do, that you are a writer. You're writing for judges, or you're writing for appellate courts, or you're writing for your clients, or you're writing to opposing counsel, and you're trying to make a point. And then a lot of times you're trying to tell a story. So the professions are related, I would say. I mean, I'm not sure that being a lawyer necessarily helps in terms of writing fiction, because as a lawyer, you're constantly being asked to simplify and structure things, and that's not always how fiction works. But it probably does help in terms of nonfiction. I mean, as a lawyer, you're always thinking about, how do I prove this? What's my evidence for this? What can I draw upon in support of this opinion? So I'd say it's a pretty natural transition from practicing law to at least writing nonfiction. Of course, the big problem is that as a lawyer, it takes up a lot of your time. Obviously, if you're doing it right, and it takes up a lot of your mental bandwidth and your emotional bandwidth, because you get involved with people's problems, and it's hard to disengage from that. You carry a lot of that stress around with you, and so being a lawyer is it can be rewarding, but it can also be it can be kind of destructive, frankly. A lot of lawyers feel like they have to solve people's problems, and those problems aren't always solvable, because sometimes the problems are the people themselves. So that may be more than you want to know about legal practice.
And how did this book come to be? Like, how did you decide that you wanted to tell your father's story?
Well, yeah. So that's another good question. My dad was sort of the ultimate do-it-yourself guy. He didn't particularly trust journalists or lawyers, for that matter. Didn't really trust journalists, and he was approached over the course of his career about writing an autobiography or writing his memoirs, and a couple of pretty well-established journalists actually offered to help and get involved, and he always said no. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think for a while, he didn't really think his story was worth telling. I think he was worried that if he started looking back, he wasn't going to be able to accomplish the things that he wanted to accomplish going forward. He was always focused on what he wanted to do next. And I think also that he wanted to do it himself, and he wasn't exactly sure how to get started. I mean, he wasn't big on narrative in the first place. But toward the end of his life, when he was, he died at the age of 80. But right there at the end of his life, he sort of changed his mind and decided, yeah, maybe this is a good idea to go ahead and write my story. And he picked out a title and sort of started working on it. But he was in fairly poor health by that time and died in December of 2017 without having had much of a chance to tell the story. So I decided to do it for him. I mean, as to make a long story short, it turns out that he was sort of his own archivist. He had kept all kinds of things in the place where he and my mom lived up in Colorado. He had literally rooms full of files. And so as I started going through those, I realized, hey, that, a lot of the story is here in these documents and photographs and letters. And that's sort of how it got started. And it became a bigger and bigger project. I started out just sort of writing an essay about his death, and it got bigger from there.
What was the research process like learning about your dad in this way, going through his files? Did you learn anything new about him while you were doing this?
I did, yeah. One thing is, my dad, like a lot of military guys and pilots, was pretty tight-lipped about his life. He didn't like to dramatize his experience and things. So reading contemporaneous letters and files was pretty enlightening about some of the battles and he had at NASA in terms of getting his projects approved. And I found this maybe the most interesting thing was finding this old file that the Navy had created to investigate an accident related to my dad. He was flying an A4 Skyhawk back in 1961, I think. He was a young pilot. He brought the Skyhawk in for a landing on the USS Forrestal. And as you may know, there's a tail hook on the plane, and it's meant to catch an arresting wire, and that's the way they slow these planes down. It's it's kind of a primitive deal where literally part of the plane catches on a wire, but that's how it works, or that's how it worked in the old days. And he came in for a landing, and the arresting wire literally ripped the tail hook off the back of the plane, and so he didn't stop. He kept rolling, toward the end of the runway. He didn't have enough speed to take off again, so he had to engage the afterburner on the plane, which is basically revving up to full jet power, and get off the deck and climb as quickly as he could. And as he was climbing, the guys back on the ship radioed to him that his plane was on fire, and he looked back, and sure enough, there was a huge plume of fire coming off the back of the plane. So there's this whole nerve-wracking story about how he was trying to get the canopy open so he could eject, and couldn't get it open, and realizing that the plane could explode at any moment, and he finally managed to rip the canopy open and eject, and he parachutes into the Mediterranean. The plane goes down in flames, and and of course none of this was ever communicated to us.
So you didn't know this story at all, or you just didn't know the fine details?
I didn't know that. I didn't, he had, a couple of times when my mom would prod him, he'd say, "Oh yeah, at one point I had to bail out of my airplane." But that's about as far as he ever got.
Wow.
And, but this file had it all, witness statements and his own statement, and the Navy, opens up this investigation, and for 6 months he's on pins and needles waiting to see if the Navy's going to say it was his fault. He didn't think it was his fault, of course, but the Navy came back and said, no, there was some sort of fault in the fuselage. There was a crack in the fuselage, and, you didn't come in too fast. It was just a mechanical problem. So he was exonerated, and his career was saved. But I'm sure that, waiting for the results of that investigation were almost as excruciating as the incident itself. But that's sort of an example. That's probably the most extreme example of knowing the outlines of a story, but being able to fill in the blanks as a result of documentary evidence.
Was it a challenge? Because the book is not just your father's story, it is yours also. How was it for you kind of weaving your own memories, which are sometimes, especially when you're a child, are sometimes quite different to what your dad would have remembered? How did you find that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it is quite different. And I'm not sure that I'm right all the time, because I am writing at times from the perspective of an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old. And we all know that human memory is a fallible thing. I mean, one thing you learn when you're a lawyer is people remember things different ways, and they tend to remember them in different ways. Those ways they remember tend to diverge as time goes by. So, I'm not sure I'm always right in the way I perceive things, and they certainly would have been. I remembered them differently than my dad would have, but they're still pretty vivid. The memories are still pretty vivid to me, and at some point, if you're writing in first person, you have to go with it. You have to say, look, this is a little bit impressionistic, but life is impressionistic, and as long as you're willing to acknowledge that maybe the truth is in the middle there somewhere, I think it's all fair game. Anyway, I think I got it mostly right. My sister occasionally says, "I don't remember that happening," and but she remembers things happening that I don't remember happening. So,
I have these conversations with my siblings a lot too. Like,
same.
Nobody remembers the same things.
Yeah. So what I remember, I mean, we went on a trip to see the launch of Apollo 17 in December of 1972, and I'm sure my mom would have remembered. My mom passed away in 2014. I'm sure she would have said she remembered different things about the trip than I do. But I remember having to listen to bird calls tapes, as we drove through Louisiana, and the fact that I had $6 in my wallet and considered myself a wealthy man, and stuff like that. So, and I'm sure my dad's mind was on technical things like, the launch window and what the mission was going to do when it got to the moon and that kind of thing. So for what it's worth, I mean, it is a little impressionistic. I didn't know how else to write the story, frankly, to make it make sense.
Were there any instances where you remembered a specific event so vividly, and then in your research realized that your memory was fallible and that you did not have it correct at all in your brain?
I'm sure there sure there was, but I can't bring one to mind right now. I mean, the big thing is stuff that as a kid I thought just sort of happened seamlessly. It turns out it could have gone many different ways. Like, my dad's whole deal with the jetpack. From my perspective as a kid, it all seemed like it was going exactly as planned. That my dad was working on it and making progress, and NASA was happy with it, and eventually it was going to be flown and that sort of thing. But it turned out, looking at the documents, that just like any project in a big organization, it went forward. The project moved forward, then went back, and then was canceled, and then was refunded. And so there was so much going on behind the scenes that I didn't know about. I mean, that was surprising to me to sort of read some of these memos back and forth about why we needed to use this jetpack and what the advantages were and how it worked and why NASA was reluctant to do it and that kind of thing. So I mean, that's the biggest thing. I can't remember anything I was outright wrong about. I just sort of had a different sense of how things came to be. That might be the best way to say it.
That makes sense. I'm interested. You said your dad had picked out the title for the memoir he would have written. Did you stick with that title, you and your publishers?
I didn't know. His title was Untethered, and Untethered, the story of Bruce McCandless, but which has a little bit of has kind of an appeal to it. But I mean, he was not an untethered person. I mean, he in some ways was very tethered. He was very tethered. He came from a line of naval officers and felt duty bound to sort of carry on that tradition. He was, in other ways as well, very tradition minded. He was very careful to uphold the standards of being an officer in the Navy. He paid his taxes. He voted. He was not untethered. He was not Jack Kerouac, roaming across the American Southwest. So despite that photograph, he was a tethered individual. And so I briefly considered calling it Fearless because he was a fearless individual. I never saw him scared of anything. But there are other books with that or a similar title, and it didn't seem to me to capture some of the sort of other dimensions of his character. He was fearless. He was a pilot, someone capable of landing a jet aircraft on an aircraft carrier at night, which requires a certain amount of fearlessness. But he was also a scientist, and he was interested in all kinds of things like animal rehabilitation and environmentalism and geology. And so the title that eventually we came up with was Wonders All Around, to sort of give a sense of someone who wasn't just about bravado, but was also about curiosity and for lack of a better term, sense of wonder about things.
Did he talk to you much about what it was like? Because you mentioned him being an environmentalist and a conservationist. What was it like for him to see the world from the vantage point of space? Did he talk about that?
I think for him and for lots of the astronauts, maybe not all, but the majority, I think it's a huge object lesson environmental concern because, they get up there, and William Shatner is a great example too. They sent Captain Kirk up on a SpaceX mission here last week, and he came down and from what I can tell was moved to tears by the experience. Being up there and seeing Earth from space lets you experience the fact that the Earth is not very big, and and the universe is extremely big, and it's unclear exactly why it is we deserve this little home with water and an atmosphere and a nearby sun. And you're sort of moved to think we got to take care of this thing somehow or other. We won the golden ticket, as a species, and we got to start thinking more seriously about how the Earth works and how we can keep it working for us. So he definitely had that experience and would mention it whenever he gave a talk, after his space flights. He was always very careful to sort of include a little environmental lesson in there. Like a lot of folks who grew up in the 70s, he liked to refer to Spaceship Earth. That was a pretty common trope for a while. And the idea being that we're all astronauts on Spaceship Earth, and we need to, because he was an engineer, he always spoke in terms of, maintaining the spaceship system. So, the valves and the currents and that kind of thing. So he spoke about it a little bit differently than I would, or y'all would maybe, but he took it very seriously. And like I said, was environmentally concerned his whole life. He and my mother both were both big into environmental issues. So.
Do you have any desire to see Earth from that vantage point now that we are sending civilians to space in some capacity?
Oh, yeah, I'd go in a minute. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, at this point I guess it wasn't a SpaceX rocket. I guess it was Blue Origin he went up with. I'm sorry. It was Jeff Bezos' company that William Shatner went up with. Yeah. I mean, both of those companies, or even Richard Branson's outfit. I'd go up if given a chance. I mean, they to a certain extent, going up on a Blue Origin mission current time is sort of like an amusement park ride. It's all automated. You blast off, you go up, 60 miles or so, and then you come back down in just a few minutes. But I think it's enough. I mean, I think it'd be fantastic to see Earth from that vantage point. And I can understand why people say that space tourism is going to be a big business one of these days. It'd be great.
I wanted to ask you about this photograph, this really, really iconic photograph that everyone's seen. I think I understood it as originally there were kind of grainy pictures, and then NASA later released this really beautiful high definition photo. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was in grad school in England at the time, and I remember watching, news coverage of the flight over there, of the mission over there, and seeing my dad, venture out. He and Bob Stewart both tested the MMU on that flight. And it was cool, but, it was pretty grainy video footage, and it was hard to tell exactly what was going on at times. And as you mentioned, it was only after the astronauts came back to Earth and the NASA technicians started developing the film from the photographs they took that they realized what a gem Hoot Gibson had captured while the MMU test was going on. He had a Hasselblad camera that, didn't have automatic focusing controls and that sort of thing. So he had to do everything himself. And he managed to get these actually more than one, but one particularly great shot of my dad testing the MMU. It's, it's in perfect focus. The colors are super vivid. And you get the strong sense that this guy, the MMU, the man maneuvering unit, is, you can't see how close he is to the shuttle. You just get the impression he's out there in space floating by himself. And the nearest human being could be 150 miles away or 1,000 miles away. You just can't tell. And so I spent some time in the book talking about why that photograph is so effective and what sorts of emotions it evokes, even aside from just the sort of visceral, good Lord, what is that person doing out there kind of reaction. I compare it to Renaissance frescoes of angels and that sort of thing. And it may be a little overblown, but who knows? I mean, it's a very effective and very moving photograph. And it shows up all over the place. I mean, you can still find people wearing yoga pants with that print and find beer koozies and refrigerator magnets and posters and all kinds of things. So it turned out to be a great shot.
When did you and your family realize how ubiquitous this shot was? It must have been weird for your dad to see his face everywhere like that, or not even his face.
I think he was really gratified by it. As I talk about in the book, he had some tough times at NASA. He was when he started with the astronaut corps, he was the youngest astronaut in that group 5. He was actually the youngest astronaut period for a while, and he was kind of a prodigy. He was a brilliant scientist, a fighter pilot. He was the capsule communicator for Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin when they walked on the moon, and it seemed like his career was really on exactly the sort of trajectory he'd always hoped for. And then, as I talk about in the book, I mean, he sort of got crossways with some of the folks at NASA, and his career was effectively derailed, and he labored in obscurity for many years and was disappointed, and finally got a shot with the MMU on the 10th shuttle mission, and lo and behold, that photograph of him becomes this huge iconic image. And I call it the accidental icon. I mean, no one knew that was going to happen, but he loved it. I mean, he was very gratified and liked being the guy in the MMU and talking about that with kids and showing off the picture. It was gratifying, and I'm still amazed by my wife and I were driving down the Gulf Freeway in Houston not too long ago, and we were passed by a furniture store delivery truck and had a big image of my dad and the MMU. I'm not sure what that had to do with furniture delivery, but it's always interesting to see the way people use that image.
I just want to get back to writing the book for a second. Your dad had obviously accomplished a lot of stories. How did you decide what to include in the book? Did you find any challenges trying to pare it down to book size?
Yeah, I did. I mean, he got involved in all kinds of NASA projects, and some of them are more interesting than others. I mean, there was a whole, he worked on the inertial upper stage for many years, and that's an interesting project and very useful for NASA, but it's not something most people are interested in. So I really focused on the two big projects, the man maneuvering unit, which was again the jetpack, and his work on the Hubble Space Telescope. My dad and another astronaut, Kathy Sullivan, along with the engineers out at Lockheed in California, including Ron Sheffield and those guys, worked really hard to make sure that the Hubble Space Telescope could be serviced in space, maintained, so that if anything went wrong, the astronauts could go up and fix it. They made sure to have adequate access to the instruments on board and made sure to develop the tools that would allow astronauts to effectively maintain the little satellite. And it all worked out really well. As you know, Hubble initially was considered a little bit of a dud because the main mirror had been manufactured incorrectly. But the good thing that came out of that is the astronauts were able to go up and fix it. And I think there were 5 or 6 servicing missions altogether that combined have led to Hubble being in orbit now for 31 years and sending back some really fantastic science and imagery. Some people say it's the most important scientific instrument ever developed. And so he was proud of that photograph of him in the MMU, but I think he was even prouder of the work he did on Hubble. Yeah, so those are the two big ones. I think those are the projects that people are really interested in. And my dad went on to work for Lockheed Martin for something like 24 years and worked on a bunch of space projects there too. But, it's the astronaut stuff I think people like hearing about. And so that's what I focused on.
Yeah, definitely. It's very inspiring to read about, I think. He accomplished so much. It's
I think it is inspiring. I mean, he wasn't untethered. He was tethered to his work. I mean, he loved his work and managed to get a lot done. But again, it wasn't all a success story. There was a lot of hardship and disappointment for many years in the middle of all that. So I tried to bring that out and to humanize him so that this wasn't just a guy who wandered in off the street and was able to go fly the MMU. I mean, he put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into that project, and I think he deserves some recognition.
Did you learn anything really surprising about your dad during all of your research?
One thing I learned that was a little bit surprising is that he put so much energy into animal rehabilitation when I was a kid during the 70s, when he didn't really have anything much going on at NASA in terms of space flights and that sort of thing. He really put his heart and soul into rescuing and healing injured wildlife, especially birds. And he and my mom both spent a lot of time on that and enlisted my sister and me as well. We had to go down to the lake every night with a big seining net and catch fish and shrimp to feed the birds. And he kept these pretty detailed notes about all that stuff. And it was pretty fascinating reading through his notes about, the injured loon or nighthawk and what he was feeding him and how he let the screech owls go one night. I was sort of aware of all that stuff as it was happening, but didn't get really the sort of scientific attention he was paying to all that. And so reading his bird rehabilitation notes was pretty fascinating.
That's really cool. Are you an animal person now, or did that turn you off owning pets?
Yeah, no, we have dogs, and I like animals fine, but no one's brought me a loon to rehabilitate, so I've dodged a bullet. I'm actually going to a big Audubon Society thing tomorrow night, where I'm going to meet up with some of my dad's old friends, and that should be fun. I'm going to bring the bird book along just to show people, and we can reminisce a little bit about all that stuff. So I'm an environmentalist. I'm a member of the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society, but I'm not as dedicated as my mom and dad were.
And I'd love to touch briefly on the other books that you've written. You've written a lot of fiction, you've written some poetry.
Yeah.
And then this book came out in July. Do you have anything in the pipeline coming up? Or are you taking
so Wonders came out in July. And then, coincidentally, I had this novel called In the Land of Dead Horses, which is sort of a sequel to a novel I wrote back 10 years or so ago called Sour Lake. They're both sort of, I'd call it the X-Files meets Lonesome Dove, or X-Files meets Indiana Jones. They're set in Texas in the early years of the 20th century, and they involve a Texas lawman who's dealing with a series of murders and trying to solve them and dealing with possibly supernatural threats as well. So that one, I had written that and completed it about a year ago, but it took a long time to get through the publication process. And that just came out in mid-September. And so I've been doing a little bit of promotion on that as well. And what I have in the pipeline, I've been writing a sort of a long nonfiction piece about, it's called Pluto Doesn't Live Here Anymore, the long, strange history of our search for Planet Next. And it's all about the possible existence of a so-called Planet 9 in our solar system. As you may know, some astronomers think there's another planet out there beyond Pluto and beyond Neptune. And there's a very energetic search going on for it. But in the midst of all this, there's also debate about what a planet is and who gets to define it. And as you may know, the International Astronomers Union, the IAU, demoted Pluto to the status of dwarf planet back in 2006. And so saying there's a Planet 9 out there assumes that you agree with the IAU definition that Pluto is not the ninth planet and that it's a dwarf planet. And so the essay is all about this sort of fight over terminology, and at the same time as we're looking for this new object out there that some people think exists. That may be more information than you wanted, and I'm also working on another of these books about the Texas lawman in the early years of the 20th century. So those are my big projects in the works.
First, I would just like to say that Pluto will always be a planet in my heart. I don't care what anybody else says.
That's right.
I'm just curious how your writing process differs from writing fiction to writing nonfiction. Is it relatively similar? Do you plot out your fiction more?
Yeah, the older I get, the more I find that I have to plot it out. But it is similar because my fiction, I do try to stick with the facts as they existed in a given time period and be consistent and true to those facts, and in terms of historical backdrop. So there's a fair amount of research involved as well. So similar processes. I have to say I'm not a very methodical person, and that's I wish I were. I wish I were a little bit more like my dad, for example. But I try to get up in the morning and write for 2 or 3 hours, and then maybe in the afternoon do some research or do whatever else I need to. But I'm pretty slow, I got to say. I wish I were a better, more consistent writer and researcher.
So we will include links. It'll be easy to find your books, I think. But in terms of this essay, when it comes out, how will readers be able to access that? Do you know where it will be?
Yeah, so I'm hoping I can get it to the point where, I think I've got about 12,000 words now, maybe a little bit longer, but I'm hoping to get it to where it's like 25,000 words and I can actually publish it as a small book, maybe just as a Kindle, maybe just as an ebook. And the reason I say that is because the science evolves and especially these days in astronomy, I'm worried that if I publish something in paper, it'll be out of date, the week afterwards. So I'm thinking an ebook for that one, but I can certainly let you know. I would say it's probably 6 months away at present. The fiction is probably a similar period of time, away.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, please do let us know and we'll.
So I've got a sort of a pretty rough version of the essay up on medium.com right now, but it's something that I'm not sort of trying to promote. It's sort of a place marker for people who can go and maybe proofread it or read this, verify that the science is right and that sort of thing. So I'm not really, I wouldn't consider that a finished product at all. It's just sort of a set of notes more than anything else.
Yeah. And we'd love to hear about any books that you particularly enjoy. Do you have a favorite book of all time?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I really love Catch-22. And I have to say it's been a long time since I looked at it. I also love, it's kind of a weird book to love because it's a violent, dystopian sort of book. But I love Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and I love a book called was it Six Frigates by Ian Toll about the American Navy's attempts to build for the day these very advanced warships and to compete with the British. And it's just a brilliant book. So that would be probably number one on my nonfiction list, along with Son of the Rising Star, which is about George Custer, and a book that Eric Larson wrote about the Lusitania. What is that? Dead Wake, I think that's called. So I'd say those, just right off the bat, I'd say those are 5 of my favorite books. Is that too many? I got a lot.
Oh, that's perfect. I have to ask because I am a huge sci-fi fan, and your books have some sci-fi elements, and obviously you grew up around a lot of actual science. Do you have a favorite fictional space explorer?
Gosh, Buck Rogers, maybe. I mean, that sounds funny, but I have a big book of the sort of a collection of the old Buck Rogers comic strips, and they're really, I mean, you start out reading them and they're quaint because Buck Rogers, he falls, he's overcome by some sort of nerve gas in 1919, I think it is, and he falls asleep in a mine in Pennsylvania, of all places, and he wakes up, 5 centuries later. And he emerges to find that America is now ruled by some sort of Asian. It's hard to say if it's China or Mongolia or someplace, but anyway, we're ruled by foreign overlords, and people get around by using these anti-gravity belts. And you're like, oh, this is funny. But as the strip goes on, it gets weirder and weirder, and over the years. And I spent many hours puzzling over it when I was a kid. So even though Buck Rogers wouldn't have considered himself an explorer, I think I'd still consider him one of my favorite space adventurers, if that counts.
It definitely counts. That's an excellent answer.
Okay.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for doing it. I really enjoyed this interview.
I've had a blast too. I hope I haven't rambled on too much, but you guys had some good questions. So
no, I could have listened to you for hours. So this was great. Thank you.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Bruce's book, we will include a link in our show notes. And if you are enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and tell all your friends. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com. And be sure to follow us on socials. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter, and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram.
This episode was produced by Rachel Wharton and Joni DiPlacido. Editing is by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and huge thanks to Bruce McCandless III for being our guest today. If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.